Welcome to today's Explainer. I am so excited you're here today because we are diving into a truly fascinating topic. We're going to explore how our most unique, quirky, and even completely hidden human traits tell an unbelievable story. And it's a story written entirely in our DNA. We are going to decode the microscopic blueprint that makes you, well, exactly you.
So I have to ask, have you looked closely in the mirror lately? And I mean really looked. Take a second to check your hairline, maybe the curve of your thumbs, or even the way your earlobes hang beside your face. We tend to just write these off as random little features, but they aren't random at all. They actually reveal a microscopic code that you inherited directly from your parents, telling a biological story that started long before you were even born.
Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine building the most complicated machine ever created, but instead of a giant paper manual, the instructions are packed inside a chemical molecule called DNA. It's wild to think about, but if you took the DNA from just one single human cell and stretched it all the way out, it would measure almost 2 meters. That's about 6 feet. And yet, it folds and packages itself with such insane precision that it fits inside a nucleus far smaller than the width of a single human hair. All that just to build the proteins your body needs to survive.
To pull that monumental task off, your body relies on genes, which are basically just small sections of this DNA. Scientists estimate that we humans have roughly 20,000 protein-coding genes. You can think of these as tiny molecular machines. They're constantly at work, building your tissues, transporting oxygen, repairing damage, and regulating practically every single process inside your body.
And that brings us to a seriously mind-blowing fact. We humans share more than 99.9% of our DNA with one another. Literally all the incredible human diversity we see across the globe, every different eye color, hair texture, height difference, it all stems from just that tiny 0.1% sliver of our genetic code. It's those unbelievably small variations that explain why no two unrelated people look exactly alike.
Let's look at how this plays out with a specific feature. For decades, high school biology textbooks loved to use the widow's peak, that distinctive V-shaped point at the center of the forehead, as the ultimate classic example of a single dominant gene. Well, it's time to bust that old grade school myth. Modern science has shown us that inheritance doesn't always follow a simple dominant or recessive pattern. Rather than just one single genetic switch, your hairline shape is actually influenced by multiple genes all working together.
Let's get a bit interactive for a second. Hold out your hand right now, straighten your thumb, and gently bend it backward. What happens? Does it stay mostly straight, or does it curve dramatically backward? If it bends much farther than average, you've got what's commonly known as a hitchhiker's thumb. And just like the hairline, we used to think this was a simple recessive gene. But actually, it's a whole spectrum influenced by multiple genes, your joint structure, and your connective tissue.
Right, so here is another classic classroom myth about your earlobes that we really need to bust today. We used to be taught that earlobes fall strictly into two neat categories, free or attached. But take a look around at your friends and family sometime. Earlobe shape isn't just two separate boxes, it's an entire intermediate spectrum influenced by several different genes. Many people fall somewhere right in the middle, and it's just another beautifully complex example of natural human variation.
Moving from shapes to colors, let's look at how DNA literally paints our bodies. If you spend an afternoon out in the summer sun, you might notice freckles appearing. Freckles are simply small clusters of skin cells that contain a bit more melanin than the surrounding skin. And contrary to a really persistent myth, they absolutely are not dirt, and they aren't signs of skin damage. They're a perfectly natural genetic variation, heavily influenced by a gene called MC1R and ultraviolet sunlight. Oh, and interestingly enough, they often just naturally fade with age. Speaking of that MC1R gene, it's also responsible for one of the rarest natural traits on Earth. Out of more than 8 billion people, only 1 to 2% naturally have red hair. This happens because a tiny variation in that MC1R gene causes pigment cells to produce a reddish-yellow pigment called pheomelanin instead of the dark eumelanin that creates brown or black hair. It's a gorgeous and incredibly rare genetic variation.
Now, if we're talking about nature's rarest artistic signatures, we have to talk about heterochromia. This is a condition where pigment is distributed unevenly in the iris, creating these breathtaking variations in eye color. There are 3 types. You have complete, where each eye is an entirely different color. Then there's sectoral, where just a part of one iris is different. And finally, central, which creates a distinct ring of color surrounding another. It's completely harmless, and it's just a mesmerizing reflection of how pigment develops before birth.
I want you to try one more physical test with me. Stick out your tongue and try to roll the sides upward into a little tube. Can you do it? If you can't, don't worry. You are far from alone in this famous and often deeply misunderstood genetic trait.
The reason this one is so misunderstood is because of a major pivot in our scientific understanding. Just like the widow's peak we talked about earlier, we were taught that tongue rolling was a simple dominant trait. You either had the gene or you didn't. But science has realized that nature rarely follows those simple yes or no rules. Modern research shows that tongue rolling involves multiple genetic factors and, crucially, muscle coordination. Believe it or not, some people actually learn how to do it later in life.
Let's shift gears to something you can't see, but you can definitely taste. Do Brussels sprouts or broccoli taste unbearably bitter to you? If you're vigorously nodding yes right now, you can blame a chemical called PTC and a highly specific gene called TAS2R38. This gene creates bitter taste receptors on your tongue. If you have certain variations, you strongly detect bitter chemicals. This likely gave our ancestors a huge evolutionary advantage in avoiding toxic plants. But today, well, it just means you might really hate kale, while the person sitting next to you tastes absolutely nothing bitter at all.
Let's move along and see how this builds into one of the most important evolutionary changes in human history. About 10,000 years ago, our ancestors started dairy farming. Now, in infancy, mammals naturally produce an enzyme called lactase, so they can digest milk. But as adults, we were supposed to lose that ability. However, genetic mutations allowed lactase production to just keep on going into adulthood for some populations. This is called lactose persistence. And what's wild is that lactose intolerance isn't actually a disease or a disorder, it's the ancestral biological default for human beings.
Okay, let's look at another surprising revelation from our DNA. If you have blue eyes, or know someone who does, you might be totally shocked to learn there is absolutely no blue pigment in blue eyes. None. It's entirely a light-scattering optical illusion. Influenced largely by the OCA2 gene, the iris simply has less melanin. When light enters the eye, the shorter blue wavelengths scatter much more efficiently, making the eyes appear blue. So it's pure physics interacting with your genetics. How cool is that? Our genes also heavily influence how we experience the physical world, especially when it comes to pain. Pain tolerance is linked to genes like SCN9A. This gene helps produce the tiny sodium channels that let pain signals travel through your nerve cells. Now, rare variations in this gene can dramatically reduce your pain sensation. And while never feeling pain might sound like an absolute evolutionary superpower, it's actually incredibly dangerous. Pain is your body's vital warning system to protect you from severe injury.
Now we're moving into some truly surprising territory with some of the rarest genetic traits ever documented. Did you know that 1 to 5% of the population is born with polythelia? That's the medical term for an extra nipple. During fetal development, we have tissue known as milk lines. Usually, this tissue just disappears before birth, but occasionally a small section remains, resulting in an extra nipple. More often than not, it's so small that people just assume it's a mole or a freckle for their entire lives. Another incredibly rare trait is polydactyly, which is when an extra finger or toe develops before birth. This is heavily influenced by a critical gene pathway with, honestly, a very playful name, the sonic hedgehog or SHH gene. Seriously, that's what scientists named it. This gene is responsible for sending the signals that direct exactly how our limbs and digits form when we're embryos. Just a tiny, tiny change in those developmental signals can produce a fully formed extra digit. If you've ever seen someone bend their thumb completely backward to touch their forearm and thought, yikes, you've witnessed joint hypermobility. This involves inherited differences in collagen, which is the protein that makes up your connective tissue. It makes ligaments incredibly elastic, allowing for some truly extraordinary flexibility. Now, this can be a huge advantage in sports like gymnastics or dance, but it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because it can also increase the risks of sprains or early joint wear.
While most of the traits we've covered so far affect isolated features, some genes influence the growth of entire tissues. Which brings us to an important medical condition. Neurofibromatosis, or NF1, is an inherited autosomal dominant condition that affects the genes responsible for controlling normal cell growth. When these genes don't function quite properly, it causes benign tumors to grow along the nerves. Early signs often include light brown skin patches called café au lait spots. It's a really powerful reminder of just how varied and widespread a single gene's impact can be on the nervous system, bones, and skin.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really need to address a massive shift in how we understand ourselves. The old textbook myth was that traits were controlled by single genetic switches, strictly dominant or recessive. But modern genomic science has revealed a much richer, incredibly interconnected polygenic picture. Almost all of your traits are shaped by dozens, sometimes even hundreds, of genes working together, constantly interacting with your environment, your lifestyle, and even just pure chance.
So the crucial point is this, and if you take away one thing today, let it be this. Genes influence possibilities. They don't determine destiny. Your DNA provides an absolutely incredible, highly complex blueprint, but it doesn't write every single chapter of your life. You are a dynamic, ongoing mix of your inherited code and the life you actively live.
Which leaves us with this final question to ponder. Out of the 8 billion people on Earth, what makes your specific combination of traits an unprecedented, unrepeatable biological masterpiece? The next time you look in the mirror, look just a little closer at those quirks and features. They aren't just random details. They are small pieces of an epic story that has traveled through your family tree for thousands of years. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into your DNA, and keep exploring the incredible science hiding right inside you.